So let's talk about flexibility first. New plants have different flexibility characteristics, and those come in lots and lots of different dimensions. So let's just start with the ramp rate. It's really important to us how quickly a plant can increase or decrease its power output. Some plants we don't expect to ramp up very quickly, like a nuclear plant, for example, where ramping is quite expensive. And other plants, like a new natural gas-fired power plant or a combustion turbine, have the ability to ramp much more quickly and respond to variations in other sources of power, like new renewables, for example. Another dimension of flexibility is the ramp time. And that's the amount of time it takes from the moment the generator is turned on to the moment it can start providing energy to the grid. At its lower operating limit. What is the plant's capacity? What is the maximum output of a plant? What is its lower operating limit? What's the minimum amount of power a plant can generate once it's turned on? What's its minimum run time? What's the shortest amount of time you would want a plant to operate once it's turned on? The best example here is a nuclear plant. Their nuclear plants are very expensive to turn on and off, and so the minimum amount of time you would want a nuclear plant to run is on the order of weeks rather than hours or minutes or any shorter time. Another key characteristic, flexibility characteristic of plants, is the no-load cost. So you want to know what the cost is of turning a plant on and having it ready to run, but actually not generating any power. So you keep it spinning, ready to increase its power output. So what's the cost of having a spinning reserve in place? And then finally, generally the startup and shutdown costs. What are the costs of turning a plant on and off? These are all dimensions of flexibility that are important in thinking about what kind of mix of power plants we want. Why is generator flexibility so important? Well, it may seem obvious, but let's go through some of the reasons why we might value flexibility, because remember, the issue we want to keep in the back of our mind is, are the valuable attributes of power plants being compensated by whatever sort of contracts and dispatch mechanisms we have? So why is generator flexibility important? Uncertainty in supply and demand, of course. With the increasing penetration of solar photovoltaic power plants and wind power plants, we have power plants that are intermittent both over a daily cycle, but also during the day. And so it's going to be important to pair facilities that have different availability because of this uncertainty in supply. Uncertainty in demand is classic, of course. Demand has its cycles over the course of the day, over the course of seasons, and in fact, one of the important characteristics of electricity demand is that from the generator's point of view and the grid manager's point of view, we tend to think of demand as a fixed property, something we can't have any influence over. If that's true, then flexibility in our power supply is really, really important. But we also want to use this as a chance to think about, well, how fixed is demand really? Can demand itself be a source of flexibility for managing generation assets and grid services? So another reason that generator flexibility is important is we want to think about the proper compensation that different sources have to get in order to encourage investment. Some sources are going to be running a lot of the time, And our baseload power plants will be running long periods of time, have a really high capacity factor, and other sources will run much briefer times because they're valued for their flexibility. And we want to make sure that we are encouraging a good mix of those different kinds of assets. So different mixes of flexibility is important, and we need to make sure that both baseload style power plants that have really long ramp times and expensive ramping are well compensated, along with those other resources that are fast ramping resources that can match supply and demand better. So the increased availability of wind and solar is a really important reason why we want to think about the flexibility of all of our generating assets. Because of the potential for big short-run changes in the supply and the demand for generation, there is a real value for resources that can make immediate responses. And you think about managing the frequency of the grid as the sort of a constant short-run management problem we have. And so having assets that can make immediate response, incremental supply adjustments as we work to manage the frequency on the grid is another reason why we need flexible assets. And I've already mentioned unresponsive demand in the short run. Again, we tend to think of demand as fixed, as given to us as grid asset managers. If that's true, then we have to have resources that can respond readily to the changes in demand. But it also leads us to think about the possibility of inducing greater flexibility in demand by having tariffs that match the cost of providing grid services more closely. We can think about having demand that responds more readily to the other conditions on the grid. So demand itself, we might even think of demand itself as being a flexible tool for managing the grid. And of course, all of the reasons I've mentioned so far for wanting to have flexible resources are made worse by transmission constraints. When there are constraints in the transmission of power, then we need to think about making sure that local generation assets provide the essential flexibility services in those localities. So we have to make sure that the given portfolio is flexible enough in local areas, because the services won't be available from other regions.